Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some really fascinating stuff to explore today, all about relationships. You guys sent over this interview with Esther Perel, and I gotta say, her ideas are really making me think differently about love and all the stuff that comes with it.
Yeah, her work is definitely eye-opening. It's not just the usual relationship advice, it's more about getting to the core of why we make the choices we do and how our past experiences shape those choices.
So it's like a deep dive into the psychology of relationships.
Exactly. And I think what's especially interesting is how she connects those early experiences, like our childhood relationships, to our adult relationships.
Okay, so let's jump into that. I was really intrigued by her idea of cornerstone versus capstone relationships. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. So cornerstone relationships are the ones that we typically form earlier in life. Think like maybe in our 20s, we're still figuring ourselves out. And those relationships actually become part of that foundation. We kind of build our identities alongside our partner.
So it's like you're growing up together.
Exactly. But capstone relationships, those tend to form later on when we've got a stronger sense of who we are. It's more like we're bringing our fully formed selves to the table.
That makes a lot of sense. So how can our listener figure out which type of relationship they're in? I mean, are there any signs?
Well, timing's a big one, like we said. But it's also about how much the two people are like merging their lives and identities. Cornerstone relationships, they often involve a lot more of that merging.
Because you're figuring it all out together.
Right. But capstone relationships, those tend to emphasize a little more independence within the partnership. Each person has already established their own thing.
So even with the same partner, we could actually go through both of those types of relationships, right? It's like Perel's idea of having several marriages throughout our lives.
Yeah. I mean, we change and grow throughout life, so it makes sense that our relationships would have to adapt too. Our needs and priorities shift as we mature.
It's like different chapters in the same book.
I like that. And it's interesting because Perel talks about how important curiosity is for navigating those different chapters, for evolving together.
So it's not just about finding the right person, but about being willing to adapt and grow with them.
Absolutely. And that means being curious about your partner, about their perspective, their needs, especially as those things change.
Okay, now I'm going to throw in a bit of science here because this blew my mind. Apparently, the same parts of our brain that light up when we're babies bonding with our caregivers, those same circuits are activated when we fall in love as adults.
It's wild, isn't it? It's like we're hardwired for connection right from the very beginning.
But that makes me wonder about, if those early bonds were kind of messed up, does that mean we're doomed to repeat those patterns in our romantic relationships?
It's definitely something to think about. Our early experiences shape our attachment styles, which can definitely influence how we approach romantic relationships.
So like if someone had a caregiver who wasn't very emotionally available, they might end up being drawn to partners who are also emotionally unavailable.
It happens a lot. It's like we're unconsciously trying to recreate those familiar dynamics, even if they weren't healthy.
But if it's all in our brains, how do we break free from those unhealthy patterns?
Well, awareness is the first step. And therapy can also be really helpful for identifying those patterns and developing healthier coping mechanisms.
It's like, okay, my brain might be wired this way, but I can still learn new ways of relating.
Exactly. Our past experiences don't have to define us. We can choose to create different patterns.
And I imagine those patterns show up in the way we handle conflict, too.
Oh, absolutely. Perel talks about the 3 choreographies of conflict.
Yeah, the pursuer-pursuer, distancer-distancer, and pursuer-distancer. I thought those were such great visuals.
It paints a really clear picture, right? Like with the pursuer-pursuer dynamic, you have both partners just attacking, clashing all the time.
And then the opposite, you've got the distancer-distancer, where they both just withdraw and avoid conflict altogether.
Right. And then the pursuer-distancer, probably the most common, I'd guess.
That's the one where one person's always chasing for connection and the other one's pulling away.
Exactly. And it's so interesting how those patterns often relate back to those early attachment styles we were just talking about.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Someone with an anxious attachment style, maybe they had a caregiver who was kind of unpredictable emotionally. They might become the pursuer in relationships, always needing that reassurance.
And someone with an avoidant attachment style, who maybe had a caregiver who was really controlling, they might become the distancer, needing a lot of space.
It all makes so much sense when you start to see those connections, right?
It does. It makes you realize that there's so much going on beneath the surface of our conflicts. It's not just about who forgot to take out the trash.
Exactly. And that's why understanding those underlying dynamics can bring so much more empathy and compassion to our relationships.
Speaking of understanding, Perel also talks about the difference between apology and forgiveness, which I thought was really important.
Right. She makes the point that a true apology isn't just about saying, I'm sorry. It's about taking responsibility for your actions and acknowledging how they impacted your partner. It's about empathy.
So it's not just about the words, but the meaning behind them.
Yeah. And forgiveness, that's a whole separate process. It's a personal choice to let go of the resentment. And it doesn't always depend on the other person making amends.
It's more about freeing yourself from that anger and hurt.
Right. Forgiveness is about your own healing, and it can actually benefit the relationship as a whole, even if the other person hasn't fully apologized.
So even if it's tough, it's worth working toward.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Holding on to anger and resentment just creates this toxic environment that prevents any real growth or healing.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about love and desire. Perel has some pretty radical ideas about those two things.
She does. She challenges the common idea that, if you fix the relationship, the sex life will just naturally follow.
So she doesn't think they're always so intertwined.
Right. She actually sees love and desire as having separate narratives, like different storylines. Each one has its own needs and ways of expressing itself.
So you could be deeply in love with someone, but not necessarily feel desire.
Exactly. And that's where her concept of the erotic blueprint comes in.
Okay, that's where it gets really interesting. What is an erotic blueprint?
It's basically the idea that our sexual preferences, our fantasies, they're all connected to our emotional history, our unmet needs. A lot of it goes back to those early attachment experiences we were talking about.
So our sexual desires aren't just random. They're actually telling us something about ourselves.
It's like they're a language, a way of expressing those deeper emotional needs. Sometimes it's very symbolic.
I love that. It's like our sexual desires are a window into our subconscious.
That's a great way to put it. And I think understanding your erotic blueprint can lead to some incredible self-discoveries, not to mention a more fulfilling sex life.
It definitely makes you want to think about your desires in a whole new way.
It does. And it can also help you understand your partner's desires in a deeper way, which can lead to more intimacy and connection.
Okay, so what happens when that erotic blueprint leads to betrayal? Perel also talks about how to repair a relationship after infidelity.
Yeah, she outlines a 3-step process. The first step, like we talked about earlier, is genuine remorse and guilt for the harm caused. That means truly taking responsibility without making excuses.
So it's not just saying, I'm sorry, but really understanding the pain you inflicted.
Right. And the second step is demonstrating value for the other person.
Mhm.
That means showing them, through your actions, that they matter, that the relationship is worth fighting for.
It's like showing them you're committed to repairing the damage.
Exactly. And the final step is what she calls erotic recovery. That's where you focus on creating new experiences to reignite that passion and connection to move beyond the pain of what happened.
So it's like hitting the reset button on your intimate life?
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just surviving and into thriving again as a couple.
Now, this all ties back to another one of Perel's big insights, this idea of the fear of losing self versus the fear of losing the other.
Ah, yes. She talks about how one partner might be more afraid of being abandoned, while the other is terrified of being suffocated, of losing their independence.
That classic push-pull dynamic again.
Right. And it can play out in all sorts of conflicts, big and small, from arguing about what to wear to, making big life decisions.
So even something as simple as disagreeing over a pair of shoes could actually be about a deeper need for control or autonomy.
Precisely. It's all about understanding those underlying needs and finding ways to meet them without sacrificing your own sense of self.
Wow. Perel's work really is about facing the complexities of relationships head on, isn't it?
It is. It's not always easy, but it's definitely rewarding. It helps us build stronger, more fulfilling connections.
I think that's a good place to pause. For now, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore in Perel's work.
There is. We've only just scratched the surface. It can be tough, that's for sure. But I think that's where self-awareness comes in.
Yeah, Perel talks a lot about that, doesn't she? Knowing yourself, understanding your own patterns.
Right. Because the more we understand our own stuff, the better we can navigate those tricky moments in relationships. It's like knowing your triggers.
So instead of just reacting, we can choose how to respond.
Exactly. And sometimes, it's about realizing, okay, I'm reacting from a place of old hurt here. This isn't really about the dishes in the sink.
That's so true. It's like, what am I really upset about?
Right. Self-awareness helps us to be more intentional, more compassionate in our relationships.
And I imagine that ties into communication, too. Perel really stresses the importance of open and honest communication.
Oh, absolutely. Even when it's hard, even when it feels uncomfortable.
So how do you create that kind of safe space for communication? Because I think a lot of people struggle with that.
It starts with really listening to each other, like active listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk.
And paying attention to all the nonverbal cues too, right?
Yeah.
Body language, tone of voice.
All of it. Because sometimes what's not being said is just as important as what is being said.
And it's about creating a space where vulnerability is okay.
Exactly. Where you can be honest about your feelings without fear of judgment or rejection.
But that's hard, isn't it? To be that vulnerable, especially if you've been hurt before.
It's definitely a risk, but the rewards can be huge. Because when we show up authentically, it gives our partner permission to do the same.
It's like, I'm being real with you, so you can be real with me.
Right. And that builds trust, deepens the intimacy.
This makes me think about another one of Perel's big ideas, that balance between autonomy and connection.
Yeah, that's constant dance in relationships, isn't it? Wanting to be close, but also needing your own space.
So how do you find that sweet spot?
Well, it takes communication, setting healthy boundaries, being willing to compromise.
So sometimes it means having these tough conversations about, what are your individual needs within the relationship?
Exactly. And remembering that your partner isn't there to complete you, but to complement you.
I love that. Each person bringing their own unique strengths to the table.
And that's what makes a relationship so much richer, so much more dynamic.
Okay, so we've talked about communication, vulnerability, autonomy. I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts on sex and intimacy, especially in light of Perel's erotic blueprint.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. Remember, those blueprints are shaped by our emotional history. They hold clues to our deepest longings.
So if we understand our own blueprint and our partners, we can start to see our desires and fantasies in a whole new light.
Exactly. It's not just random. It's an expression of those deeper needs, sometimes in really symbolic ways.
That's such a powerful shift in perspective.
It is. And it can be really liberating, both for individuals and for the relationship.
Perel's also a big advocate for open communication about desires and fantasies, right?
Absolutely. Even if it feels awkward or, vulnerable at first. Because when we share those intimate parts of ourselves, it creates a deeper level of trust and connection.
So it's about being honest about what turns you on, what you fantasize about.
Right. And that allows you to co-create a sexual experience that truly works for both of you.
She also challenges that idea that sex should always be spontaneous and effortless.
Oh, yeah. The reality is a lot of couples struggle with desire discrepancies, or they get stuck in a rut, and that's normal. It doesn't mean something's wrong with the relationship.
So what's the solution? How do you bring back the spark?
Well, sometimes it means being more intentional, like actually scheduling time for intimacy.
I know some people might resist that idea. Like scheduling sex. That sounds so unromantic.
I get it. But think about it this way. If intimacy is important to you, why not prioritize it? Just like you'd schedule a date night or a workout.
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
But it makes sense.
It's about making a conscious choice to nurture your erotic life. And sometimes a little bit of intentionality can actually lead to more spontaneity and excitement in the long run.
So it's not about forcing it, but about creating the space for it to happen.
Exactly. And it's about taking ownership of your sexuality, making choices that align with your desires and the vision you have for your relationship.
I love that. It's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Right. And that's really what Perel's work is all about, I think, helping us move away from those autopilot reactions and into a more conscious way of relating.
It's about understanding the forces that shape our patterns, developing our self-awareness, and choosing to create the kind of love we truly desire.
It's powerful stuff. And it gives us real tools to navigate those inevitable challenges that come up in any relationship.
Because, let's face it, relationships can be messy.
Oh, absolutely. They're full of contradictions, ups and downs.
But that's what makes them interesting, right? Like, if it was always smooth sailing, it wouldn't be much of an adventure.
That's a great way to look at it. It's about embracing the journey with all its twists and turns. And those challenges, they can actually make the relationship stronger in the end.
I think what I appreciate most about Perel's work is that it encourages us to be more mindful. Like, we don't have to just let things happen to us. We can actually make choices that shape our relationships.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that conflict's going to happen. It's inevitable. But instead of fearing it, you can actually view it as an opportunity.
An opportunity to learn and grow.
Right, to understand your partner better, to deepen the connection.
So for our listener who's been with us on this deep dive, what would you say is the biggest takeaway? Like, what can they really put into practice?
Well, I think the key message here is that relationships aren't about finding that perfect person. It's more about navigating those inherent tensions that exist in every partnership, like the tension between the individual and the couple, between love and desire, between stability and change.
It's about accepting that there will be bumps along the way.
Exactly. And that those bumps don't have to be the end of the story. They can actually be the beginning of something even deeper and more meaningful.
It's about facing those challenges together with curiosity and compassion.
And a willingness to evolve, both individually and as a couple.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with one final thought. If your erotic blueprint is a reflection of your deepest emotional needs, what does yours reveal about you? What might you discover if you really explore those hidden desires and longings?
That's a great question to ponder. And the answers might surprise you. They could lead you to a deeper understanding of yourself and a more fulfilling love life.
So remember, the journey of self-discovery and the evolution of your relationships, it's an ongoing adventure. Embrace the messiness, the complexity, and above all, embrace the possibilities. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Esther Perel.